Okay, looks like we're live. We have been for 5 seconds. Hello, how's it going?
It's great.
Good. Welcome to Why We Roll. This is a game design podcast. We really focus on tabletop role-playing games, but today we have a special episode. It is the first, it probably won't be the last, where we're going to talk more about other physical games and sort of the Venn diagram, the concentric circles, the... help me out here, Tetris block metaphors, linking different genres of physical games. So, imagination-based, story-based games that use physical props to, we could probably talk about computer games too, and certainly card games. But board games are going to be the focus. So that's sort of the genre why we have a couple board game aficionados, dare say experts. So thank you so much for joining us. And I will say at the top of the show, I'm Wythe Marschall, and my co-host and producer Chris Pickett is not joining us because of technical difficulties. So everyone wish Chris's computer well, and we will, sally forth and have a good conversation with the three of us. So thank you guys for making time. Yeah. Sarah, so we have two amazing guests. So Sarah Shah is a board game expert, and do you want to introduce yourself? I've met you a couple of times through Aaron, and we really appreciate having you on for a variety of reasons. But I know you create board games in a minute, so I don't know if you want to say a little about that work, and if there's other board game work you're up to. But we also want to thank you because you did actually help us when we were launching Stillfleet, even our first big Kickstarter. You kind of weighed in and helped us think about how to get people's attention with physical games in that space. So we really appreciate having a little more of your time and to hear more about kind of your perspective on just what makes games fun. So Sarah, do you want to say a little about your background?
Sure. I don't know how much of an expert I am. That's a very weighty term. But I've been playing board games for many years, and I started my own channel, my YouTube channel back in 2020, and I've been creating content since then, and I cover a lot of games which are launching on crowdfunding websites like Kickstarter or GameFound. So that's how I was able to know a lot about Kickstarter and kind of give you guys some tips on Kickstarter and stuff like that. So board gaming is like my nighttime hobby and passion, and during the day I work as an attorney, but board games are a very big part of my life, and I attend a couple international conventions in every year as well. So UK Games Expo is one of my regular conventions, and I've started making Spiel Essen my other regular convention, which is the largest board game convention in the world.
Yeah, wasn't there like 50,000 people at it last year?
Oh no, way more than that. I mean, I think you're talking about Gen Con numbers.
Gen Con is like 80,000, I want to say. So Spiel is
like Spiel Essen is like I don't know, like more than that. It's a lot of
really
people. Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, it's humongous. Like the convention center is gigantic. Yeah.
Well, we're very jelly. That sounds super fun. One day we will get to UK Games Con and Spiel, but for now we're US exclusive. That's super cool. And so, I mean, if people want to find you at the top, they can look up board games in a minute, and you've reviewed like hundreds of games, right? Like a lot of games. Yeah.
A lot of games, like a lot. And my own personal collection is around 700 or so board games. So.
Wow.
Well, so Sarah used to live in Ithaca. That's how we met. And Sarah gets copies, like review copies of games, and then she would bring them to the local weekly board game meetup. We get to play them, which is always super awesome. So you get games that even other people haven't played yet.
Oh yeah,
you're so ahead of the curve.
It's pretty cool. I mean, I found it harder in Ithaca to get people to play games that weren't released yet, which I was shocked about. Like when I became a content creator, I was like, oh, people are going to be so excited to play games that, they're the only ones who are playing it in this world. It's not released yet. And that was not the case. Like most of my friends wanted to play games that they knew really well. And I was like, Are you serious? Like if I had a friend who had these exclusive games, I'd want to play them.
Well, we can talk about playtesting. That's very much the same in TTRPGs. You can make something really amazing that no one's ever seen, and most people look at you and be like, yeah, let's play 5e or whatever, right? Something they know. And I think there's a cognitive basis for that. The idea of like 80-20, these kind of, I don't know that the numbers make any sense, but this sort of general Pareto rule of like, people want things to be about 80% or some percentage familiar. and maybe they'll accept a certain amount of innovation. But so that's great. That's something we've talked about with TTRPGs before, but I'd love to hear your take on kind of acceptable innovation in board games. Before we hear more from, let's just keep calling you an expert, and you can keep saying no, but expert Sarah Shah.
Okay.
We'll introduce our other guest, our good friend Aaron. Aaron, you
Hi.
are a member of the team, but
Yes.
you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? You're also many other things, I should say, but you have created products for Stillfleet.
Yeah.
So thanks.
I won't list all of my hobbies because we have other things to talk about. But for the company, at least, I do all of the coding, website stuff. I built the Strings app. I wrote Rain Thieves, the book we released during the Kickstarter. We just shipped off a card game that I designed, which I'm assuming we'll talk about later in the show. So I don't want to bury the lead, but we'll talk about it later. So I am going to bury the lead. And I'm working on another game that's set in the Stillfleet universe, and I have like at least 3 or 4 other games. So you and I were talking earlier today yesterday about the Reiner Knizia's 50 drawers thing, which I know, Sarah, I think you know about that from interviews, right? Like Reiner Knizia has 50 drawers of games he's working on. So I was inspired by that. So that Kallax shelf that used to hold board games has boxes, and each box is a drawer. So I'm trying to, it won't hold 50, it'll hold 24, but
that's still a lot, though. Making 24 games and getting them out there.
Yeah, especially when that's not even my day job.
Yeah.
This is my nighttime job.
For now.
Yeah, someday. Goals.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for making time. And yeah, Aaron, if people want to find more about you, more about Stillfleet, they can go to stillfleet.com. Mm-hmm. But also you can tell people now and remind people at the end, if they want to find out about other projects you're working on, feel free at any point.
Yeah, I'll put links in show notes.
Okay.
Too many to list here. Yeah.
Cool. So, yeah, I mean, I guess the core, to kind of kick it off, the main reason we originally scheduled this, I think is still a good reason, which is, Aaron, you and I have been talking a lot about what makes a fun board game. And I thought one simple idea would be to ask someone who knows, maybe even more, has played even more games than you, and you've played more than I have in that space, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I really focus on story-based games, on books. And so I feel like I'm learning. I grew up playing some level of board games, and there are some more modern ones that I quite enjoy. I played a lot of like Dominion, like Arkham Horror. There's some random ones that jump to mind, but for the most part, I play story games. So I think it's an interesting question for both of you. What are some of the differences, or why board games? And I don't know. I mean, maybe I again, Sarah, no pressure if you don't want to comment on this. But what are some where does that Venn diagram, right? What are ways in which we can think about different kinds of pleasure, different kinds of attention? The biggest ones that come to mind for me, some of it is just like time or investment. Board games usually tend to be faster, although they get more and more complex, I feel like, all the time. So now I wouldn't even say that's true compared to RPGs. But yeah, what do you all think? Like, is that even a good question to ask? Is that a good sort of rabbit hole to go down? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you asked a couple of questions. So is the main question what makes board games fun? Is that the question we're answering?
That's a good question, yeah.
Actually, that is a good question. Why don't we start there and we'll come back to other games after we talk about board games for a while? Because, why not? We have you. So, yeah, what makes board games fun?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that makes board games fun is, it's an activity that you can do with other people. You're sitting around a table. It's something you can do together while having fun, and it'll give you opportunities to make jokes and, just get to know each other better depending on the game you're playing. But more specifically about the board games, I think the board games that are the most fun are the ones that are like highly thematic and really tie in the theme and the mechanics of the game really well together. And I really find games with more player interaction to be more fun, because there are a lot of board games which are like solitaire multiplayer games. And basically what people mean by that is that, yeah, you're playing with other people, but you're very much doing your own thing and you're having no interaction with other players. But I personally enjoy interactive board games where you are getting to interact with other players.
Yeah, Aaron, do you want to say anything about, just basic game loop, what are some
Sure.
fun? I mean, maybe again for both of you, what are some specific kinds of fun? Drilling a little deeper beyond that typology of sort of solitaire and more interactive.
For me, I love tinkering and figuring things out, and board games specifically, give you a small, confined universe that has defined rules, and then you can learn those rules and then learn how to play in it. And like, so the act of playing a board game is sort of um, getting to deal with something where you can see the whole picture usually. And I personally find that to be very satisfying. I agree with Sarah that it is more fun with other people, especially when you're able to actually interact with them. But I do also enjoy like a how can I wombo combo out like a crazy amazing turn, and win, or just it's the idea of like really grinding the crunchiness on it and figuring something like that out. I enjoy that as well.
Is that a term of art, wombo combo?
That's I didn't make it up, but yes, sure.
I haven't heard Wombo Combo, but I've heard Combo-tastic. Like, I really enjoy Combo-tastic games where, you get a whole bunch of combos going from a really good engine that you've built. And yes, it's so satisfying when you get so much out of one turn.
Yeah.
It's very, very satisfying. Yeah.
Sarah, one of my favorite games for player activity that you and I have played before was, and I always forget the name of it, but it was the one that was set in the Queen of Hearts garden. Where,
Oh,
do you remember
that deduction game, Paint the Roses?
Yes, that one.
Yeah.
That was so fun.
It's a really cool game, and it's just got amazing components. Like, I have the all-in deluxe version, and that's another thing I love about board games is, like, I know that maybe people might think that board games have gone a little bit too far with their components and, making really deluxeified games, but, like, when I get a game with just stunning components and stunning artwork, like, they are pieces of art themselves, board games. Like, they just handling the components, like, when they're just really, really nice, it's just very, very satisfying.
The Paint the Roses one, it's cooperative. Like you want to achieve the same goal together.
Yeah.
Which is like guessing. It's like, what was it? We have to guess what the other person has.
Yeah, you're trying to beat the Queen of Hearts from reaching the end, and you need to it's been a long time since I've played it, but it is a deduction game, and we're trying to give each other clues about like where certain kinds of plants or something are in the garden.
That's yeah. So yeah, that was like that was a lot of fun because it was both the solving the puzzle, but it was also the like figuring out how to communicate things to each other.
Yeah.
Within the rule set of the game.
Yeah, and you couldn't talk, right? So that was one of the rules. You couldn't actually speak. Yeah, so you have to learn how to communicate without actually speaking and giving away certain bits of information that you're not allowed to.
Wait, isn't it? You can say like one word, right? Like you can say a color.
Yeah, you could say one thing, I think, but we couldn't really say too much else.
Right.
So it's like it's almost got like a taboo mechanic built in too. Like also complex otherwise, scenario. That's great.
Yeah, it's a lot of Wythe. I'll have to find it and then we can play it sometime. It's really cool. It's a lot of fun.
Just looking at the box on the website. That's great. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like something you're getting at is like there's a tension between, I guess, games being mechanically crunchy and very, very simple or sort of approachable in that sense. And there's also like a related but different axis of like simplicity versus this hyper complexity that not all games are headed in, but we certainly see in games get really like I recently played for a friend's birthday a mega board game which I'd never played, which was like there were 20 people or something, and it was played at 4 locations across this guy's house.
What?
And it's a Vampire the Masquerade game, and I grew up playing Vampire the TTRPG where you pretend to be vampires, but this was very much like a skirmish game, but it had a lot of resource mechanics, and it had a whole bidding thing where like some of you were voting on stuff, and so there were sort of 4 teams, and you do it in these big turns where like each person can do one thing each turn. And it does kind of ladder up. It did work, but it was amazing to me that you would even try to design, like it felt like, why aren't we just LARPing? Like, it would almost be simpler. And yet they'd mechanicalized it to the degree where everyone was kind of doing board game stuff with some head scratching and whatnot. So anyway, that's just to say, I feel like, okay, board games have gone in that direction too. But yeah, what are so I mean, you mentioned Paint the Roses. Are there other games that jump to mind right off the top of your head that, like, I don't know, people may not know about, or anything that you just feel like we got to talk about this game that's super fun? Is that like a dumb question because you've reviewed like 1,000 games?
I mean, it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah.
There's so many games. It's
Right.
like I want maybe you to just narrow it down a bit more. Like, what kind of games would you like us to talk about?
I can say one of my favorite games from my childhood was this game that was published by, I think, Discovery Toys, but it may have been republished by a different company. But it's called Bazaar. I think, Sarah, I think you and I might have played it.
Is it by Sid Jackson?
It has like colored glass beads, and you trade them.
Oh, no. I must be thinking of another game, but I do think that you and I played that one time. Yes.
Yeah. So the game has, you have these 2 different bartering cards that get played out, and each of them has 5 or 6 different exchanges, and you have 5 different colored gems, and each turn you can either make a trade in either direction from either card, or you can roll a die and get a random gem of your choice. And then the goal is to get sets of 5. There's 4 different purchasing cards that you can buy by trading in 5 gems, and you want to try to buy those gems with as few remaining gems as possible. So it's about optimizing what you have and the efficiency of purchasing, but at the same time you're racing against other players to get the same ones. So you have to make decisions about, well, I could buy this now and get 3 points, or if I could trade these in I could get 5 points next turn, but then the other person might take that same one. So there's a competitive aspect where the actions of the other players matter to you, but there's also the crunchiness of like calculating, what I'm going to do. And I like that it's mostly deterministic and not so much stochastic. Like the dice rolling is there, but you don't have to do it. So
That reminds me of a game, The Quacks of Quedlinburg. Have you played that?
I haven't, but I know the game you're talking about.
Yeah, so it's a push your luck game, and it's a what do you call it? A bag building game. So you have a bag. Each player has a bag with different chips in it, with different values, and the different chips have different powers. And
Okay.
you're pulling out chips, and you want to create certain potions, but you don't want to explode by getting too much of a bad thing. It's a lot of fun. It's a very accessible game. That's just a lot of fun with a lot of player interaction, I feel like.
Cool.
Yeah, these are great. So, and it looks like, this Sid Saxon character made a lot of games. It turns out, which is so interesting to think about these genres too, where like there's just so much to know. There's so many games, and they're not published. They're not all kept alive forever. So there's sort of arcs for some of them.
Yeah, it is Sid Saxon. You're right. That was him. Yeah.
Oh, I was right. That was a good guess.
Very, very good.
Yeah,
Well
it looks
done.
like it's on at least one site has it like his 6th best game, but apparently the guy made a lot of games. So that's like
He made a lot of games. But what you just said, a lot of older games are getting published into newer editions with upgraded artwork, upgraded components. So you do see nowadays a lot of older games, especially Rainer Knizia, who was a designer that we were just talking about before we started recording, I think. But Rainer Knizia, a lot of his older games are getting republished with new artwork and stuff like that too.
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, I guess that's a question. We'll come back to sort of mechanics and fun, because I really want to get at this question of the different kinds of fun having and the different kinds of overlapping and non-overlapping, magisteria of nerd culture, but also like the different kind of cognitive tasks. Like Aaron, you were bringing up, all these things that to me sound like things that I would try to design out of RPGs to a large degree. But I mean, I guess there is a different kind of fun to be had. And the same reason, I mean, I like playing poker, and it's obviously to some degree there's a kind of mathiness to it, and knowing the likelihood of a card showing up or not is pleasurable. But to come to the market question, I mean, maybe this is just a general, I'm just curious, like where do you see from a high level, having reviewed a lot of games in the Kickstarter era, the hobby going? Is it that it's growing and that there's just so many people buying games that's a generally good thing? We're going to have more and more innovation. What are some trends? I mean, I'm just genuinely like, I really got to know.
Yeah. There's so many trends, I guess.
Yeah.
There's trends in towards like certain kinds of themes, there's trends towards certain kinds of mechanics, and things come and go, right? So like one year, like for example, zombies might be super popular, but like recently we saw so many mushroom games, like so many games about mushrooms as a
Really?
theme. So yeah, so
Like after
lots of
Morels?
huh
After Morels?
yeah, after
Oh,
Morels, like way
oh,
after Morels. Like Morels
okay.
was a much older game, but like within 1 year, I think I backed like 3 or 4 different games on Kickstarter that had mushrooms as a theme. So yeah, so you'll see different games that come up in terms of theme, in terms of mechanics. Like 1 year, it was an innovation for basically a worker placement and a deck building to be in the same game at once. Now that's not so much an innovation. Like now you'll see many games do that, right? But once a game does it for the first time, and another publisher might have thought about it at the same time, and they might release their games around the same time period. Like I'm thinking of Lost Ruins of Arnak and Endless Winter, which are 2 games that have both worker placement and deck building. But then after a while it doesn't, and even I think Dune Imperium, but then after a while it doesn't become as much of an innovation, and it becomes more common, and then people are just trying to think of the next big thing. Yeah,
Right. So it becomes metabolized within
it
the sort
does.
of
Yeah.
collective knowledge of game designers, and becomes a tool that we can use. And yeah, the next generation will probably bake it in more often.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Like
So
in
do
the
you
game
see?
I'm designing. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go
But
ahead.
yeah, like in my own personal game that I'm designing, I'm trying to also have it be both worker placement and deck building. But at this point in time, it's not innovative. So I feel, as someone who hasn't designed a lot of games, hasn't actually published a single game yet, but I feel like it's something that's doable for me now because I've played so many games that use both of those mechanics now.
Yeah, well, that's something we should definitely talk more about. I definitely want to hear about your game, and maybe that's where we can spend the bulk of our time. Is kind of like how does one design a good game in the board game space? And then yeah, Aaron, I mean, I definitely think it's there's a question of adaptation that we can start touching on with TTRPGs and try to bring it back to that world. So yeah, I feel like the mushroom thing it's huge with RPGs as well. I mean, it sort of never stopped. I keep feeling like every season we're gonna see it slow down, and then there'll be like 5 more like mushroom Borg type books that come out.
It's cordyceps from climate change, I'm telling you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it's good if it leads to some sort of ecological awareness. I worry that is a sign that that there's not enlightenment happening. It's just
We're just all becoming mushroom.
No, yeah, it's just like I don't know. It's not meaningful anymore, right? It's just like a thing people are doing as a reflex. But I could be wrong. Maybe it is that people are going out in the woods and gardening. Yeah. So I guess turning to Sarah. I mean, I'm curious. When did you decide to make a game? Is this recent or is this?
Oh God, no. I mean, I think Aaron is the better person to ask about game designing since he's actually gotten a game published now, whereas my game has been in the works for many years. Because my issue is that I'm a perfectionist and I'll start with like one idea in mind and then I'll scrap it and I'll be like, oh, maybe this mechanic will work better. And then I'll scrap it again and then I'll start over with something else. But I think I've gotten to the point now where I have an idea in mind that I'm really going to try to execute and not like push aside for some other idea at this point in time.
Knowing what your game is, would it be okay if I mentioned something about it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So one thing that I think is really cool about your game is what inspired you to make it in the first place, which is something you actually really care about, and that was motivating you to create the thing. So I'm sort of setting you up if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, no, it's still a huge motivation behind my game. So I have volunteered at elephant sanctuaries in Thailand. So a lot of people know about how elephants are poached in Africa, but I think fewer people are aware about the horrors that Asian elephants go through. So people aren't aware about how elephants need to be trapped and killed in order to be trained for various industries, whether that's like trekking or circuses or logging and elephant massages and being used in temple festivities and all of that. So people aren't aware about the horrors that Asian elephants go through. So I am working on a game about rescuing elephants from these various industries in order to put them into sanctuaries. So I want my game to be both fun and educational. Yeah.
Well, that's really great. I mean, that is why we make games. That's why that I started the company was to have games that are number one fun, but yeah, like number two, have some sort of ability to open up a space of conversation about something meaningful about, generally sort of politics, society and the environment, ecology. And I'll just say, the elephant issue is quite real. And going to Thailand, it's very noticeable because there's a lot of elephant sanctuaries. There's a lot of people fighting to like end the use of elephants for essentially entertaining tourists. But there are still a lot of people, like using elephants to entertain tourists in a way that is like clearly not good for these animals that are extremely intelligent. They live, as long as humans. I mean, it's just an insane, it's a really like very visibly obvious, like that shouldn't be happening, kind of situation.
No, it shouldn't be happening, but it still is happening. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of places are now masquerading as sanctuaries when they're not sanctuaries. So more and more of these profit generating places are seeing that, people want to do ecotourism. They want to, make more ethical choices, and they will masquerade and claim to be a sanctuary. And then once people get there, it's too late. They've already paid, to do a day visit at the sanctuary and then find out that it's not actually a legitimate sanctuary.
It's a little like the question of eating, sustainable slaughter or sustainable, pasture raising of cows or so. And it gets into those questions. I just think with elephants, it's so ridiculous because they're a lot smarter than cows for one. I don't know. There's a lot of reasons. But
elephants are amazing animals. I mean, they're so empathetic. I often say they're more humane than so many humans. Like they take care of their young. They have nannies. They bury their dead and mourn for their dead. Like they're just amazing animals, and they don't deserve. No animal deserves, that kind of treatment, but especially not elephants.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really awesome, and I definitely want to support your game and learn about it. If you don't want to talk about it, you don't have to, but we definitely can, because it's true that we've published some games, and Aaron recently published this card game that Aaron you worked on for a long time, so we can definitely talk more about that.
Sure.
Which is a little bit maybe I guess it's a question for y'all, how you feel card games fit into board games, and whether one is sort of a subset of the other, or they're often distinct enough to kind of treat effectively as two different things. I do think, Sarah, it'd be great to hear kind of how you're going about thinking about game design. And I think there are a lot of overlaps that I see, and I hear already in what you said, like with TTRPGs too, you can have a good idea and noodle on it for 10 years or more. And you can also say, no, I'm going to sit down in a month and just make myself publish something on itch. Instead of 200 pages, maybe it'll be 20 pages, but and maybe it'll have typos, but also like that's life. And otherwise no one will ever know. No one will play it. I can't get feedback. Another piece is like having to resolve, or not resolve, that'd be great. To deal with this question of kind of the didactic nature of the thing you want to talk about philosophically, and then the fun of the game loops, and do they interact, and how do they interact? Which is something, we've certainly talked a lot about. And Aaron, I know, like with Mullinger, right, we've talked about, does it feel like you're being a middle manager who's, resisting the evil company they work for in some way? Or does it feel like you're just being a bad guy? Or does it feel like none of those things because it's just worker placement and people play board games and don't think about it? And like, are we okay with that? So I guess it's a choose your own adventure. Do either of you want to talk about game design? Is this a good time, Aaron, to talk more about your game? Sure. Or Sarah, do you want to? Should we come back to you with like questions about the elephant game, or do you not want to talk about,
I'm happy to talk about it.
Great.
Yeah. Did you want to go first, Aaron, or shall I?
Yeah, sure. I'll take the ball for a moment. I would say that like one thing that I found, because I also have that problem, Sarah, of like always having too many ideas and then always pushing the goalposts back, like, oh well, I could make it a little bit better. And I definitely feel that deeply. What I've done for myself for that is I just do brain dumps. I learned last year that I can use voice dictation with the Apple Notes app. And so when I feel that like my brain is full of an idea, I will just do a brain dump and dictate to my phone. And then it becomes like this 10-page long screed about whatever the idea was. And then it's out of my head and then I don't have to think about it. And then I just keep an archive of those. And then sometimes I'll suddenly have an inspiration where I'll feel like, oh yeah, that idea that I just had would go really well with this other idea. And then I can kind of combine them. But that way I don't get too distracted away from the goal of like trying to push the game forwards. But sometimes, you hit a roadblock. the game that we keep alluding to that I worked on that we're releasing very soon is called Robot Hospital. The working title was Robot Factory when it was just like, being developed in a prototype. And that went through like many iterations of change, and also had many moments of experimenting with different ideas and trying to expand the rules universe, but also contracted at the same time. It's sort of like if you can imagine making a sculpture where you're inflating the marble into the shape, but you also have to like shunt the marble in at the different spots to get it to be the right spot, like you're sculpting a malleable balloon almost. That's sort of what the process has felt like, because there's always like that the tension between making the game bigger to make it be everything it needs to be or wants to be, but also keeping it tight so that it is only what it needs to be to get the theme across. The game itself, and I've played it with both of you, so you both know, but it's a very basic, like 10 to 15 minute trick taking game. I think it has some innovative drafting mechanics about like you're dealing cards into piles and you take all the cards from a pile. It's a kind of an adaptation of some other draft mechanics that I've seen, and the player interaction is all very simple. You can steal cards from other people, you can steal cards from yourself, you can munge other people's work that they've been working on. I don't know. We have to just have a link, I guess, to the page on the show notes, right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, but I think of it like having played it. So I think we should talk. Yeah, we'll talk about Robot Hospital. Sarah, let's talk about your game, and then maybe we'll come back to Malinger.
Sure.
And maybe Sarah, you can comment in general on sort of these questions of game loops and innovation and board game design. But something, Aaron, your game reminded me a bit of just classic set making card games, but it had the innovation of stealing cards, which felt generally just fun. And I think it's something that like I remember early on, like when Magic was young, there was that interactivity, and that was like outlawed because people were spending a lot of money, and you didn't want to have basically little kids using their allowance to buy expensive cards. And then some of them, it was like cut them up and throw them onto the other card or whatever. And it's like, well, mom and dad are going to be real mad about that mechanic. And so it was interesting. Yeah. But I love that, like, you have stealing, and it's not, because it's not Magic, right? It's not collectible. It's just one deck where you're cutting it up, you're getting some cards, and then you're able to both make sets in a very intuitive way, but also do some of this light sort of thievery. And you had already the kind of idea of it being a science fictional universe. And so we brought it into Stillfleet because you've been writing for Stillfleet, and we thought that was a nice way to kind of push the idea a bit. But yeah, I think it's a really fun, repeatable, game. And I remember also liking the fact that, you want it to be for all ages, so that kids could understand it, but it wasn't like dumbed down. Like it has strategy that, like, obviously adults are going to pick up on probably generally faster. But it allows a smart kid to catch up and get into it. So I think that's all just to set the stage for, like, from my understanding of why you designed it, how you designed it. You had certain kind of goals in mind in terms of its simplicity and complexity, the interactivities, and the target audience. And then years later, we're very lucky to publish it. So we're very happy to do that. I guess, Sarah, I don't know if you, what's a good question? Have you played Robot Hospital, or when it was Robot Factory? And what do you think in general about, I guess to go back to that question, are card games board games? Trick question, not a trick question. Stupid question.
I guess yes and no, because, for example, if you go on the website Board Game Geek, you can look up any card game and it'll be there, like almost any card game. But, I guess when you get into, creating, for example, top 10 lists, right? People might end up creating a separate list for card games and not even include it in a list of board games. So some people will include it and others won't. I feel like it hasn't really become gone one way or the other for everyone to do it, a certain way. So,
But so it's like irresolvable tension there.
Yeah, like sometimes there's there are games which are really, really good. Like for example, there's a card game that I picked up at Essen, Spiel Essen, which is the largest board game convention in the world. I picked it up last year. It's called Far Away. Really, really great card game. Like just very, very thinky in a small box with incredible artwork. I think in America it was picked up by Pandasaurus as the U.S. distributor of that game. So this is a card game, but I think a lot of board gamers will play it because it does offer something very new and innovative. It has a very innovative way of how you play the cards in one direction, but you score them in the other direction. When it comes to scoring, it's just really, really tricky like that and just so good. So I think it depends on the game itself, whether board gamers will include it in the board game category or just be like, oh, that's just a card game. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I think if you're going to distinguish between board and card games, I think that you would be at a level of specificity where you would also say like tactical games or role-playing games or other. You're distinguishing amongst games, where there's also a way to just say board games and mean like social games that you're playing with other people that are not like athletics games, for example, where you're moving physically around.
But would you say, like, do people describe TTRPGs as board games? Because I don't know that I've heard that. I feel like board games is usually reserved for
I've not heard that.
Games. Yeah.
The only time I would say a TTRPG would be similar to a board game would be with something that has heavy tactical elements, like maybe was that I want to say Ghost. Oh God, what am I?
Well, there's a lot of overlap with war games, but also interestingly, I feel like war games are not. Oh, Gloomhaven, yeah. I feel like Gloomhaven presents an interesting case, and skirmish games in general are they, is a war game a board game? I mean, this is kind of like the card question. It's a trick question, but I also think it points at the kind of Venn diagrams here, and maybe that gets at the game loops of. So war gamers want to have a story component that you might find more in a TTRPG. And a freedom of kind of movement, but also they're very constrained in terms of mechanics, more like to me like a board game. Also, so I think of them as board game like, but
the legacy type games that we've seen a lot come up with, like Pandemic Legacy and Risk Legacy, and those other ones where the changes you make in a session affect future games. That feels like that's pushing into the TTRPG turf a little bit because you have the campaign aspect. And I think anytime like Gloomhaven or other games where one session can feed or bleed into the next session, sort of blurs the boundaries a bit.
I think it doesn't because you don't have character and you don't have real story. You don't have dramatic tension that a character. You don't have catharsis of a human.
I wouldn't say they're the same
character,
but
no. But
a little bit of fun.
But I hear you. Like King's Dilemma is the most complicated board game I've played, other than that weird mega version of Vampire. But even King's Dilemma ultimately is constrained mechanically. So while you're inhabiting a persona and you're trying to lie to people and convince them, and it's very freeform during the kind of pre-resource allocation main phase, it's still not an RPG. You're not actually a person. You're kind of an abstraction of, government moving through time. And I think the same with war games too, which is why I think of them as not very RPG-like at the end of the day, because your little dudes are still not real characters with emotion that you care about. You're trying to win. They're a finite game. You either win or lose. In almost all these cases.
Did you play Diplomacy? The classic, like
that's that's an old one, right? That's like
I want to say from the 70s. It's
I don't think I played that.
It's a game. I believe it takes place in World War II or early to mid 1900s. Each player plays a nation, and you're making deals, and maybe you want to invade another country. I think you have objectives. I haven't played it in literally decades, but there's the way that you take over another country is by making agreements with other players. So you actually have to have narrative discussion with other players. And then when you go to actually make actions, everyone says what they're doing. And maybe you made an agreement with someone and maybe they honored it, maybe they didn't. But then that, what the outcome there then informs future actions. So it's like highly deterministic because all the players are making decisions about it. So I mean, but it's not a role-playing game, but also like
it's again, like Model UN, right?
Yeah, very much closer to that.
it's a simulationist game, but the thing it's simulating is, again, not emotional catharsis in the manner of I come from fiction writing and teaching fiction, whereas the things you're describing and what I experienced in King's Dilemma or Pandemic Legacy, which is super fun also, and I agree the campaigness feels similar in some ways, but I think it's still kind of a different thing. Sarah, I want to get you to comment on this. I do have just one question that just occurred to me, which is how much did you influence Robot Hospital or Robot Factory? Did you play it at all? I mean, how often? I take it maybe you play tested it. Did you give Aaron feedback?
Oh gosh, I think I played it once, right? So I don't think I influenced, that game much at all. So I would not really be able to comment too much on that. In terms of TTRPGs, I'm not, I tried doing a TTRPG campaign one time. I think I attended maybe I don't know, 6 or 7 sessions. It just wasn't my cup of tea, just really not something that I'm into. I like having a constrained, I think Aaron was saying earlier, a set of rules that you can play by. And TTRPG just seems so open-ended to me. And it just wasn't my cup of tea. But there are board games that I think also lean towards that. Like you guys mentioned Gloomhaven earlier. These dungeon crawler types of games with a lot of characters and a lot of lore and all of that. Those don't even appeal to me because I feel like they get more into the TTRPG territory and away from board games. I like strategy games that can be played in one session. I want to be, one and done. I want to sit down, play a game, and then I'm done with this. And if I want to do it again, I can do it again. But I'm not going to sit there thinking, oh, when's when can we finish it? I don't want something to drag on forever and ever. So,
if you have to do a doodle to see when you can play your board game next.
Yeah, that's how you got to do these games. That happened for me with Gloomhaven and with King's Dilemma. We did finally finish King's Dilemma. It took a year on and off. Gloomhaven, the first session I played went so over time. I think we were fighting fucking wolves and goblins, the lowest level. But you have a horde of little dudes and you're fighting other little dudes, and it was so boring. To me, it was honestly the worst aspects of D&D with the worst aspects of big board game design. There was nothing about it positive other than they had really cool little character sheets where you could mark off advancements. The character sheet design, it should have been a completely different game. It should have been a skirmish size game, at most 10 figurines on the board, and use more of that kind of advanced, rapid, I'm gaining a level, I get a power, with kind of like Arkham Horror, maybe get a deck building mechanic. You could see where they had a good idea and then went way off the rails with 3D printing little goblins with meat cleavers and stuff. And, again, not fun to actually play.
You better not post that on Board Game Geek. You would get a lot of people showing up with pickaxes and stuff at your house. Oh, gosh. Because there was a battle going on between Gloomhaven and Brass Birmingham at one point, which is now, I believe, the #1 game on Board Game Geek. But for the longest time, it was Gloomhaven, right?
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah. And so then finally, once Brass Birmingham started making its way towards the top, you had people that were just creating accounts and trying to downvote one game or the other just to keep their game in the #1 spot. So if people heard your comments about Gloomhaven, I mean, it doesn't bother me.
Well, hopefully they will. Hopefully they will, and they'll come at us, and that will drive the numbers up for this show.
Yeah.
That's a safe hot take, I think.
Yeah, I mean, at least in literary RPGs, I think the idea that expensive games with dumb mechanics that are just not as fun as D&D, but doing the same, it's the same as old school D&D. You're just fighting goblins. There's it's there's a better way to do that, which is either Warhammer or D&D. Frankly, are both kind of the same thing, but more fun. But they had really good design for the character sheets. I'll give them that. What is Brass Birmingham? I've never heard of this.
I haven't heard of this either.
Game.
Yeah, you haven't heard of it, Aaron. We've not played it.
No, well, I'm gonna look it up. I don't think I have.
Yeah, it's an economic game with route building in it as well.
Okay.
Yeah, it's designed by Martin Wallace, and I don't know what else to say about it. I've played it a number of times. I
have not played it, but I'm looking at the pictures and it looks amazing. I definitely want to play this.
Yeah, we can play it sometime if you want. I really suck at it. I'm not even sure I like it that much, to be honest. But
is it more complicated Ticket to Ride kind of a thing? Because it's about trains, right?
Oh my God! If you want to compare it to Ticket to Ride, way more complicated than Ticket to Ride. Yeah.
Is it? And this is Birmingham. This is hey y'all, welcome to Birmingham, or is this oh you're in Birmingham?
The latter. It looks like.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
so
says Industrial Revolution, which
Yeah.
Yeah, you have different modes of transportation. You can go by like railway or boats, and you're trying to build up your networks. You're trying to acquire like coal in order to power factories, and you're trying to produce beer in this game. I mean, there's a lot going on.
Yeah. Well, I have to ask Sarah, because this is one of my things with these board games. I mean, it's the same with TTRPGs, and they're not, we talk about it a lot. We talk about it on the show, but fantasy game, like D&D is a fantasy game. It's a Tolkien-esque fantasy game, and so its problem is kind of settler colonialism in an earlier time period. Although there are steampunk games and sci-fi games, and I make sci-fi games, but the board games like Ticket to Ride, Settlers of Catan, it seems to be stuck in this early modern industrial revolution space. A lot of these games, and I wonder about this kind of legacy of like, we need to build coal to have the longest railroad, to move the most laborers to terrible working conditions, to make the most money. It's like a weird idea to like, you inhabit that persona in the game.
Wait, have you played
no, it's caused a lot of controversy in the board game space.
Okay, I'm glad. Sorry, please.
Have you played Puerto Rico?
Oh my God. Well, yeah, again, please, but I'd love to hear Sarah's thoughts. This is what I want to ask. Like, what is up with the politics of these games?
Yeah, no, there's been so much controversy in it because, like, with people becoming more and more, I guess the term is woke, and understanding that colonialism is bad and we don't want to portray ourselves as colonialists who are going in and, just pillaging and, taking over a land, whatever. It's because in board games. So, more and more publishers have started to hire cultural consultants. They'll have like, if they are doing something that's based in history, they'll maybe have like a little blurb in the beginning of the rule book to explain, to even say, we do not approve of this. We don't approve of colonialism. And they'll like try to, explain that it's just a historical setting. But I think more and more board games are trying to get away from the player playing a colonialist, like someone who's actually colonizing an area. So I think they are trying to get away from that as a theme. But of course, you have people who are like, no, like, don't make board games political. Like, why? We should still be able to enjoy our games and be colonialists, So you're going to get all kinds of people who want to play all kinds of characters in games still, but you will find a lot of pushback for those kinds of themes now.
I understand. I mean, I do understand why the colonialist themes and imperial themes come up so much in board games, because it's the idea of expansion, of conquering, of using resources to become bigger and stronger. Yeah. And that's still also the basis of what drives colonialism and imperialism. I mean, maybe with also racism, but
it's like the 4 E's, right? It's like it's exploration, expansion, exploitation, and what's the other one? I don't remember what the other E is.
Evangelism.
Evangelism. I don't know, but
I'm gonna look it up.
It's like a genre of board games, like 4E board games. I cannot remember what the other E is, but it's.
I'm looking it up. Oh, it's 4X. It's 4.
Oh, it's 4X. Okay, not 4 E's. But it's funny because they so far all began with E.
Oh, extermination is the 4th X, and also it could be E or
extermination.
X. Yeah,
Nice.
Four X's.
Expand, exploit, exterminate. Yeah, it could be 4 E's or 4 X's.
Man, I thought old school D&D was bad, but y'all are still talking about extermination. This is I worry for this.
There's a whole category of 4X board games, and I mean that really does go kind of hand in hand with colonialism. I mean, those 4 E's or X's are represented in most colonial.
Well, there was the old computer game Civilization, the Sid Meier's series. He wasn't the first one to do the 4E or 4X genre, but like, you're literally on Earth dealing with literal actual civilizations from history, and the goal is to, like, one of the victories is domination victory, which is conquering everyone else. It's like, oh yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons it comes up as a theme is because, one of the there's so many different kinds of mechanics in board games and so many different kinds of board games, but like area control is a major one, right? So area control comes up in a lot of board games in different kinds of ways, whether that's war games, whether that's like route building, you want to control the biggest area. So, it's just something that just comes up. But I think people are moving away from that theme into more modern themes. Like, there's just so many board games in existence. And unless you're really in the hobby, I think you won't be exposed to as many of them. So maybe you might not be as aware as someone who is really like deep in the hobby, that there are just so many themes out there. Like, for example, one of my favorite games is an area control game, but you're playing as clouds. So you are clouds that are watering a field beneath you and trying to grow certain crops, and you're trying to push other clouds out of the way or do whatever, and so, or steal raindrops. Like, it's such a serene theme, but it's an area control game and can be pretty brutal.
Yeah, that sounds so interesting and much more abstract, and I think more interesting to me to go in a direction that's just not as anticipated, right? Because as you say, armies battling it out for space, the idea of little wars has been around for a long time, and so arguably chess, and Go, the great games, right, developed from some version of little wars that became, sort of ritually codified, so the rules were more fun, frankly, and the more fun versions, left Persia and China respectively and became, kind of the games for a long time. But I think it's interesting to think about that, where what are the fun mechanics and how do you reskin them? We played a similar game at Flag last year with sheep, right, Aaron, I think, or something. Like you're trying to block out the other sheep in the pasture, and it was that same idea of like, it is a kind of competitive, hyper competitive game about land, but you're sheep, so it doesn't have the feeling of Puerto Rico or Settlers of Catan or Ticket to Ride or any of these games where it's like, let's exploit the underclass. Like, that's just such an odd like feature that and I have to say, like, it also came up, Aaron, like with your game, with the idea of like a factory, and like could we come up with some other idea for building robots that wasn't capitalist competing to make money off robots, but some other version, or what else could lead to people building or repairing or working with robots that wouldn't seem like just kind of naively saying, whoever builds the most stuff is kind of better because they have the most resources. You win life. Like, it's such a weird, metaphor.
That's a good point. I would say that the factory theme was literally, I was grabbing for the easiest low hanging possible theme, because I just needed something to tack on to the rules that I was building out. And so, and I think maybe sometimes with some of these games where they are doing either the 4Es or they're, imposing colonialist ideas or themes into a game, maybe it's that, if we're being charitable, that maybe they just didn't think about the ramifications of what you're really asking players to do here when you're bringing little brown wooden tokens over. what's actually happening here. But the factory game, like, I didn't feel married to the idea of it being a factory. It was just like, well, I have parts and I want to make the parts whole again. This was a building something like a workshop or whatever. But yeah, like reskinning it to being a hospital instead, easy.
And it's not to ding you in any way. It's actually to say, I think it was an interesting point in game design where we had your mechanic that was fun. We were enjoying playing the game and thought, well, we could print some cards and try to sell a product that is, an inexpensive, fun game that anyone can learn. But what is, if we step back, like, what are the players, what do they represent, and what are they doing? And is that something that, how excited are we? Do we have other ideas? Are there better ideas? And taking that time, I think, is part of the design process that at least I think we're interested in. And I'm guessing many professional game designers are interested in doing is kind of thinking through the logic, not only of the play loops and the mechanics, but in a way, like, what does their game represent? And as you said, Sarah, maybe it's kind of a sign of the times. It's just, more and more people are aware that, like, it's probably a bad look to naively go into a situation and say, oh, oops, we're doing a colonialism. I thought that was okay. But I am curious to go back to the elephant game. Like, Sarah, can you take us through a little of your design process? And I don't know how you're approaching, to the degree you can speak to it. I know it's still in process, but like, how do you want to bring in the didactic element, or, have there be a theme basically on top of fun mechanics?
I guess my way of approaching it is a little bit different than Aaron's, because I do have these connections in the industry, right? So I do have a number of designer friends, people who have who work in the industry, who work for some big publishers who I really admire. So I've had a couple of mentoring sessions with some of these designers or like people who work in the industry. And so when I am designing my game, I'm kind of keeping the things that I've learned from these designers or publishers in the back of my mind, because I don't plan on self-publishing my game. I want to sign it on with a big publisher someday. And I hope that it'll become one of those games that people will be able to one day see at Target or Barnes and Noble. And so when I'm, thinking about designing or actually working on my game, I'm thinking about all the advice I've gotten from these designers who, talk about how you can actually get your game into a mass market store where it will be recognized by people, because I want to get my elephant message out to as many people as possible. So I'm trying to market it and gear it in such a way that not just hardcore gamers will enjoy it, but your average person who just happens to be walking through Target and it's like, oh, maybe I should just pick up a board game. That might be fun. And sees my game sitting on the shelf and it's like, oh, this is cool. It looks like it's about elephants. You know what I mean? So I have to take into consideration a lot of the advice I've gotten from designers when I ask them that question. So they say, it's really about finding a balance where you can keep it interesting enough for hardcore gamers, but simple enough for it to actually appear in one of these stores someday. So
is that back to that kind of 80-20, like some innovation, but a lot of handholds or familiar game loops, mechanics, features that people will kind of grok right away, right?
Yeah, like, I talked to, so one of the designers I've spoken to, he does really, really crunchy games. His name is Ryan Courtney. So he's done games like Curious Cargo or Pipeline. And so talking to him, he was like, yeah, like if you want your game to be in Target someday, you can't like have like these really complex mechanics in this game. Like I had all these crazy ideas in my head about my elephant game, and he was like, no, like you gotta take it down a few notches if you want more and more people to play this someday. So
well, that makes me think also of, which this also again came up, Aaron, with your game, and we've talked about more recently and more in depth with Malinger, but kind of adaptation and like having different versions of things. And I almost wonder if many game designers, and I haven't even read, I can't even say the guy's name. The guy's name whose first name starts with an R and last name starts with a K and an N. That guy. Yeah. But having, if you have an idea, when do you bifurcate and say, okay, maybe I'll do for myself just the really fun, crunchy version where we're modeling elephant cognition and sociality over 80 years with a community. And then we'll do the Target version where it's a game you pick up and play in 30 to 45 minutes. And, it has simplified rules and like, I mean, I don't know. Is that some, maybe to try to formulate it as a coherent question? Can you talk us through the process of making rules concise and still fun? Like how do you simplify and preserve the core?
That before Aaron answers, that actually reminds me of games like, for example, Scythe, like by Stonemaier Games, where they have like a board game that hobby board gamers would play, but then they come out with a kids version, which is called My Little Scythe, like My Little Pony, but My Little Scythe instead. So maybe the idea should be to design the game you want and then take away elements from it and make it a little bit simpler. Maybe that's the better way to do it.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think all right, so okay, one thing I wanted to mention first is I picked this book up earlier this year. It's by Sarah Shah. It's Thematic Integration in Board Game Design.
Oh.
It's amazing. It's not a thick book, but wow, is it dense. It's fantastic. Highly recommend it. But I think with Malinger, the game that like is set in the Stillfleet universe, it has a combination of different mechanics and like ludiums or like game ideas that we've borrowed from a bunch of different games, but finding ways to make it feel like the flavor or the theme of Stillfleet, but also play in a way that is like a board game. And Wythe, I had sent you that GDC talk by the guy that made Fallout into the tactical tabletop game, and that talk was amazing. We should put the link in the show notes because it's so good. But his whole challenge was taking a video game and turning it into a playable tabletop game that still felt like the flavor of Fallout, the video game, but also played like a tactical game. And the ways that he did this, the ways that he iterated on it and managed to preserve the theme while finding the intersection, I thought was just like astounding. So I've been trying to take a lot of inspiration from that. Yeah,
I mean, it's such a good talk for a variety of reasons, but also because Fallout is IP at this point, so it's really this particular view on the post-apocalypse that is making fun of American Empire, and kind of version of Americana in 1950s, both culture and technology, but also he's dealing with the fact that like there's a Fallout TTRPG, for example. So there's many versions of Fallout properties, both in video and tabletop before. And so to make the skirmish version, like the definitive new war game, you know, it was really interesting how he sort of considered all of it and boiled it down and was able to come up with really good constraints. And I agree that there is something matchy there, although it's different, not translating from a video game, but from the more like an RPG complexity video game to a sort of less complex space of the tabletop. In the case of Stillfleet and Malinger. So the TTRPG has like multiple books with different kinds of rules that can interact in different kinds of ways, and ultimately it's narrative. Whereas the board game needs to have kind of strict loops that resolve neatly. And so that sort of similarity with the video game, while not truly open-ended, the video games are so big, even the early ones are RPG-like. They have all of these different stats going on. And he sort of walked through like, I don't want to model all of those things because it just is like not fun when you're playing, you know, with cards and dice and little figures on a board. But I'm still curious, you know, so I guess maybe, so we should definitely talk about Malinger. Sarah, can you say though a little more about your game and just kind of where you're at with like what are the mechanics and how you've approached it so far? I know it may change, and I love that idea of kind of the kids version, adult version distinction. Like that seems like I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? Like just saying some people might like a more complex or less complex version. But how have you approached kind of bringing elephants to the center of a board game? Like how do you interact with the elephants in the game? I'm just really curious.
I feel like you're not really interacting with the elephants. It's more about just trying to acquire them by having the resources you need, having the necessary space in your sanctuary, having the necessary food and medicine to take care of them, and having the necessary workers you'll need in order to take care of them. So this game has gone through so many different iterations, and at one point, and I think the iteration that Aaron has played with me before was where there were different worker types. So I had like, a driver, I had like a volunteer, I had like a mahout. A mahout is a person who like is actually the elephant caretaker. And I've actually come away from that iteration now, and now I have a totally different iteration of this game. So it just keeps on evolving in ways that I hope will make it more approachable but still enjoyable. So the latest iteration has taken inspiration from this board game called 1929 Melier. So in this game, it's a worker placement game still, and there's still cards in it and stuff like that. But you're just trying to, in this game, players are trying to put together strips of film, and they're trying to create like a movie set and make sure that they have the actors in the right place and stuff like that. So they're putting workers in different parts of the board. And so when I played this game, I really, really enjoyed it. And I was like, this is a problem with me. Like I'll play a game and then I'll be like, oh, actually, this might work really well with my game. And then I'll just scrap everything and then start a whole new iteration based on one game that I played because I'm just so inspired by it. So yeah, so maybe I'm not the best person to ask about board game design because this keeps on happening to me. But right now I'm on an iteration that's more similar to that than a previous game that would have been more similar to, which was Obsession. Obsession is my all-time favorite game that uses different kinds of workers and you're building up a tableau, but it's about managing your family's wealth and reputation in like Victorian England. So,
cool.
Totally different theme than elephants, but I had taken a lot of inspiration from that for a previous iteration of my game. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
No, that's great. So you're kind of piggybacking from game to game, and I imagine keeping a few things like kind of the Magpie approach and
I can't I can't fully copy a game, although as a lawyer I can tell you that mechanics are not copyrightable. So if you really truly wanted to, you could actually take a game, completely reskin it with a different theme, just take all the cards from that game and be like, this resource will convert to this resource in my game, this resource will convert to this resource, just create totally new artwork, and you could actually publish it if you wanted to and have no issues legally, as long as you're not copying text word for word, and it would be totally fine. I don't think it would go down well in the board game community, but legally you could do that. So
I think with the idea of bifurcating, like when to bifurcate, the thing that comes to mind for me is in college I had a creative nonfiction prof who would talk about murdering your darlings, and what she meant is like when you have this idea or specifically like a line of dialogue or something and you're like, oh, I have to keep this in, it's too good, that's usually a good indicator that no, you don't, you should take it out. And so a lot of times if I'm toying with a mechanic, I'll keep thinking like, okay, I have to build something around this. But what I've learned is that you can kind of take a page from like Stone Soup, where you've put this idea in and then you've built everything around it. And then if you remove the idea, a lot of times the structure you've created building around that concept can self-sustain. And it's actually more interesting because now it's something new where you built it on top of this original concept that people know, but now you have this whole other thing that is new and it's adjacent to it, and it still gets the 80-20 thing you mentioned earlier. Like you have a little like a fairy ring, like the mushrooms are expanding, and you have the I forget the name of what it's called, but like as the mushroom blooms outwards, it keeps making a bigger and bigger ring. Is there a name for that? Did I lose it?
I'm sure there is in.
Oh,
Are you talking
in
about like the
mythology.
mycelium network, like how all
yes.
mushrooms are kind of
In like the middle of a circle, it like expands outwards and becomes a bigger and bigger ring. So like what I'm thinking of is that you have the initial idea and then you build the things around it and then you remove the initial idea and now you have something entirely new.
that's a very cool concept.
So
Yeah, I think absence. If you look at the kind of growth of RPGs around D&D, I think you could see a lot of that, where the original game is you literally get experience points when you get gold, and you get gold when you kill monsters, and you're a hero and monsters are evil, and or rather they represent chaos and you represent law, which is even more kind of insane when you really think about the wording of that. But over time, people have discarded so many of these mechanics where now, things like, you might have a wealth score or, a social status that goes up and down, but you're not tracking individual pieces of gold, for one, because it's annoying. It's table maintenance, it's cognitive burden, large numbers that are sort of meaningless. You're also not tracking experience. But I mean, that was there for a long time. And you can see designers kind of beginning to be okay collectively, like you're saying earlier, Sarah, with sort of certain moves happening. So I imagine the same is true with board games in general. And yeah, with any specific board games evolution from the initial idea to the end, you may go further away from the center of the original fairy ring, or you may not go that far if it's you just hit a walk-off home run. But yeah, that makes sense, that there's a kind of letting go of the original idea that might have to happen to find the ultimate version that's the most playable for the biggest audience.
I always try to at least honor the idea by writing it down and then I stick it into a file or a folder somewhere so that I still have it.
Yeah,
because
and then you light it on fire, right? The Viking funeral.
Yeah, but you keep a copy of it so that
Sure.
you can use it later if you want. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah,
no, that's why I have Evernote. Yeah, so when I light my notebooks on fire, Evernote is preserved. Well, okay, so I do want to talk about Malinger and maybe get Sarah's thoughts. I don't know. I guess this is as another question. If you the two of you have talked about it, so whether this will be sort of fruitful, boring. I mean, Sarah, please tell us. We could talk about something else, but we've been working on this adaptation of a tabletop game into a board game. And when I say we, I mean really, especially in the last year. I mean, Aaron primarily has been working on this, so it's sort of an idea that we had. You can probably remember the origins better, but we talked a lot about it, and now Aaron is on sort of a major second revision. Is that fair to say? Sort of a second version of the game.
Yeah, that's very cool.
So
it's not published, and I don't know. I think we're trying to make a playable playtest-ish version of at least a lot of it for Gen Con.
I'm trying to make something that Wythe, at least you and I can play together.
If you find us, listener, at Gen Con and hunt us down.
Specifically ask about it.
but so I guess that's a question. I mean, Sarah, have you and Aaron talked about this game? And if not, maybe we could talk a little about that process of adaptation and some of the things that go into it.
We've talked a little bit about it, but
Cool.
I just saw some news today from a publisher that they're converting one of their board games into an RPG. So they've come out with products for like an RPG, and the board game is Tricerian from Mind Clash Games. So you guys are going in the opposite direction. And I've heard of a lot of board games that have been inspired from RPGs, in fact, or as you were saying earlier, video games. But yeah, so it has been done before. So.
So, and do you feel like that is? I guess that's this question we were originally talking about. How do you adapt in one direction or other? And as Aaron said, the Fallout example, that is a really good talk of how someone took an RPG video game and made it a skirmish board game. But so in this case, it's a bit similar, but we're taking an NSR, like a modern tabletop role playing game, and making it into, I guess, like a worker placement, resource management, but card-based board game. Is that fair to say, Aaron?
I guess you'd have to like see what the story of the RPG is. Is the story more like, like fighting based? Is it more about exploration? Is it more about like building something together? I think you'd need to know about the world in order to then determine which mechanics would work best with that world and theme.
The initial inception of the idea for this was I believe it was a Discord message I had sent Wythe like a couple of years ago, where it was like, okay, Lords of Waterdeep X Stillfleet ? And then
I think that's right.
Yeah, and then you and Ethan and I got into a call, and we just started like noodling around on some ideas, and then it just sort of grew from there. But the premise of the game is that in a similar way that Lords of Waterdeep makes you the quest giver, and then the tokens that you have represent like the adventurers that you're sending off to do missions for you. This has you in the role of like the middle managing boss, the refactor in Stillfleet lore, and you have workers who would be the players in the TTRPG version, but in this case they're just possessions that you have, and you're sending them off to do work on different like destinations and like different Goldilocks world and other places. So there is a worker placement aspect, but there's also some elements of the RPG in that like the individual void miners can possess things on their own. They can individually level up once each. There's a small amount of attachment because if you've put invested effort into making one of them better and they die, that sucks. But we also wanted to have some intrigue because the basis of the game is malingering, which, like using company resources either adversely or at least wastefully that is not benefiting the company's growth or expansion. So I think the challenging thing thematically was deciding on how do you represent malingering in a game. And what I've come up with so far was you had to first define like, well, what does it mean to not malinger? What if you're a good company person? What is it you're doing? What is in this game, in this rules universe? What does the company want? And if you were to play that straight man character, what would you be doing? And then what would be something that would pull in like orthogonal direction? And then how do you accomplish that goal, but using the mechanisms and the means of doing the normal thing? And that sort of like 90-degree rotation, or at least pushing towards that 90-degree rotation, is sort of how I've tried to thematically define malingering in this game. And I intend to include at least some kind of maybe like quasi defector mechanic where like one person their goal is to be the company man. And because I don't think it should be in every game, but having like one person where you might be that person, I think would be fun, because then you have someone in game who's working against you, but you don't know it. But
have you played Battlestar Galactica?
No, I've played Coup.
Okay.
Is that what I'm thinking of? It felt like it was in that universe, but it was a different what am I thinking? I think it was Coup. Yeah.
Can you be Cylons in the Battlestar Galactica board game?
Yeah. That's when he said that. That's what that's why I thought of that game, because you do have Cylons who are working against everyone else, and you're trying to figure out who the Cylons are and stuff like that. But yeah.
I still think it'd be hilarious to play Secret Hitler, but where everybody's a liberal.
Oh, that would be funny. So you should do that as an experiment sometime. Just be like, all right, guys, we're gonna play Secret Hitler tonight, and have you would have had 2 copies, so you turned all the cards into liberals, and no one knows. Oh my, that would be so much fun. Oh my god, I would love
as
that.
Like a social experiment. I'd be very curious to see how that goes.
That would be hilarious. I would love that.
I love a philosophical game. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question too that you raised. That is not what we initially thought about with turning the RPG into the board game, which is what is the normal version of life for these people who are so abstracted now at the level of the board game. They're like, cubes on top of cards, on top of larger hexagonal cards, whatever, so it's sort of like, instead of in your mind, you're picturing people, this is just society, and there's groups of them sort of moving around and whatever. And yeah, I think it does raise an interesting question about the game universe. And that's where, Sarah, to your question about like knowing the universe. I mean, in this case, we do, because we have published, not one but multiple books about it. So there is sort of lore and things to explore, and it becomes more like that question from the Fallout video of sort of what is fun to adapt or keep, and what do you just throw away because it's sort of not fun, it's not relevant. But I do think something that we arrived at was the idea of factions mattering more in this game, because it's not about the individual's experience of going out and doing essentially sort of space adventures, and eventually, hopefully, sort of resisting the company. But it's more that middle management. You're seeing a lot of people come through, and so what matters more is generally what you want and generally what your faction wants. And so resource management, but articulated as kind of politics. Although I think we do lean on the language of faction in a way to avoid some of that real life political baggage, because ultimately it's a game set far in the future, and there's aliens and whatnot. But yeah, I think it's been interesting to see the ways in which it could be adapted. I will also say, having never worked on a board game really before this, that we've already made, I think, kind of 2 complete versions that are pretty different, and we may not be done, which I really like to think we're done, but I guess we'll find out at Gen Con even, check it.
I like the direction this is going, and it feels like the 2 big things that I changed since the first iteration. The first iteration featured in the individual void miners had die types, so like you would roll dice, and then that would be the way that you would interact with like other in-game elements, like events and other things. But temporarily, I've sort of like I've removed the stone soup. I've taken the dice out of it for now, just to see, well, what does it look like if we just had static numbers? If the void miner had a number, and then you had to achieve a certain threshold to accomplish a thing, then you can plan it out beforehand. You don't have to worry about the dice being a factor. And then
Sorry. So, like, what kind of a weight level are you thinking of for this game? Have you played Dune Imperium? Like, the more you guys were talking, the more I started thinking of the board game Dune Imperium. So I was just kind of thinking, like, how big is this game? What is the weight level of this game? Like, how is it weighted?
I was sort of targeting like in the realm of Lords of Waterdeep, like in terms of complexity. I don't know, because I think we need to get, like, I need to inflate the marble mineral enough to get the game to be what it wants to be, and then we can carve it down to like add simplicity or remove simplicity or double negative. Like we can shrink it down and make it more streamlined. I think once we find something that sort of works.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, I guess I'll be surprised. Hopefully we can talk about this more, more and more in the days ahead. But it just made me think, even in thinking through this, Sarah, what you said of kind of going through whole versions of the game. And I think that is a little bit different than TTRPGs. Even though systems may change, it's like usually, because the bigger idea is in a way the world or the theme, you usually don't discard that per se. I mean, you might. So the mechanics definitely, and I would say with Stillfleet that they definitely changed to get to the grid system, and then have evolved without, the big underlying things changing. But it does seem like with board games, maybe there's this openness to kind of throw out more, I would say, which is almost surprising to think about. But maybe it comes from the fact there have to be more elegant mechanical interactions at the end of the day. Whereas with RPGs, you can leave certain things open-ended. You can have more moments where a rule just kills you because whatever, it's a deadly game. Or it's the opposite is very common in the NSR, that a rule kind of says, well, actually, you can always decide to ignore, you don't actually die. The monster's not that bad. But I feel like with a board game, you can't do that, right? You have to make strict choices. So it might just be that as you iterate, you keep running into walls where you're like, you know what? I'm just going to do something completely different, which I really like. Like, the more I'm saying this, I think it's a flaw. A flaw of RPGs, maybe, that we don't run into walls as quickly. Maybe when we're really trying to go to, not writing stories, but trying to go to the root of, like, in a way, mechanical interactions, right? And simulationism.
Okay, so I need to find it, but there was this video on YouTube I watched a while ago that was talking about cheating in video games versus cheating IRL, but it wasn't cheating in video games. It was like hacks. Like you've probably seen a video of someone doing like a weird glitch in a game and using that to like get to like the last level for in the first 2 minutes of the game or something like that. So they were comparing exploits in video games versus exploits in sports. And what they were saying is that in sports, the rules are a function, or rather the rules are a function of the gameplay. So everyone has to affirmatively play by the same rules, and the act of doing that is what actually creates the game. Whereas in video games, the rules are imposed as the experience. The rules are the world you're playing in. And so if you're able to do it, it's technically allowed because it's literally allowed by the video game. And I think that might be the difference between play in tabletop role-playing games versus play in board games, because in a board game you have all of the rules defined as a structure and you're playing within it, and so the goal is to maximize or find the best paths, and you have this playground, everything is allowed. Whereas in TTRPGs, the play or the experience is a product of the narrative you're creating, and the rules are sort of there as long as you're all agreeing to play by them. You're all assuming the role, and by assuming the role, it creates the experience. Does that make any sense? I feel like there's a parallel.
Very interesting. That made a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. And I think that's one of the main problems. I think that's the whole maybe sort of activation energy cost of TTRPGs is you all have to agree to like do goofy acting improv together, which is maybe harder than all agreeing to respect the mechanics that you do in a board game or a video game, because the mechanics are narrative and they're in you. So you know, some people find that anxiety producing, or just it costs, there's a cognitive burden there. And they view games as things that should be sort of externalized, I think, from the psyche and relaxing in that way, where it's in the way I just watch TV, right? I can just play a video game. Even though, I mean, again, video games have gotten so complicated now that to me, it's the reverse. So I play RPGs and write all RPGs all day and talk about, story and acting. But then with video games, I get very anxious because I'm like, I don't know what to do. Oh, I'm bad at it. Oh, I got killed by a pterodactyl. Damn it. I got to make a new character, and it like causes me that, an enormous amount of anxiety compared to board games and RPGs personally. But
like if you do an exploit in a video game, like, and it's successful, like people can't really blame you. Like, I mean, it maybe makes it not fun if it's like a fighting game or something, but if the game allows you to do it, like, if like in a board game too, if the rules say, look, I can do this, and this is a thing in Robot Hospital, was like people kept bringing in their own self-imposed constraints on how they can play. Like, oh, I can only use the chroma grapple to take a card from the discard pile. I was like, what do the rules say? Oh, wait, I can take it from other people's hands. It's like, what do the rules say? I can take it from anywhere except a completed robot that's been scored. Wait, anywhere? And I'm still waiting for someone to take a card from another table. I want to see that happen.
Let's do it at Gen Con, Aaron. We're gonna have cross table madness with this game.
Yeah, but yeah, but with RPGs though, like if I do an exploiting thing that's technically allowed by the rules, but it makes the game experience bad, like that's shitty,
Well, but again, the rules. What are the rules? I think the mechanics are frequently broken all the time. People agree on like, well, technically that character died, didn't die, rolled high, rolled low, but we're gonna interpret the result differently than one might strictly because it's more fun. And there are purists who believe you should always have these very strict kind of mechanical versions, but I find in reality nobody really plays that way because it is a story game, it's an improv game. Whereas I think the true finite games, video games and board games, card games, to your point, it's not fun if suddenly the rules change and no one can agree on them, right? Part of the fun is from the mechanics being kind of locked in.
Speaking of which, there are board games where the rules are continuously changing throughout the game, and I do not like those games at all. I'm like, what's the point? What is the point of this then? Like, if you don't have a set of rules and you're continuously changing the rules throughout the game, I just don't think that's fun.
Those games are called nomics, Nomics. Nomics. It's like a Flux is an example of that.
Flux is an example, yeah.
I've never played Flux, but I have seen it, so I'm vaguely aware. I mean, that is, yeah. And and of course there's debates even in TTRPGs. So I shouldn't speak for everyone in the hobby. I'll just say, I think it's more about, the story, than the dice. Well, we're coming up on time. Sarah, I wanted to return to, maybe if you could tell us a little about, we haven't really touched on it much, but I'm curious about how you got into reviewing and maybe some of the things you feel like you've learned as a reviewer, or
Oh yeah.
I don't know, just thoughts from that kind of side of things. But we've been talking a lot about design because that's usually what we do. But
Sure. Yeah, I actually ended up getting into reviewing during COVID lockdown because, I kind of ran this board game group that would meet weekly, and then when lockdown happened, I was just really, really missing board games, and I just wanted to keep them as a part of my life. So it's like, what can I do during lockdown to keep board games in my life still? So I started just create on TikTok. I started creating these 1 minute overviews of board games just for fun, and it kind of blew up overnight. Like I was like, if not the first, one of the first board game content creators on TikTok. And now there's so many, like I could not count how many board game content creators there are on TikTok. There's just countless, creators now. But since I was one of the first ones, that kind of just really helped me to get my name in the industry. And publishers started reaching out to me asking if they could send me games. And I was like, you want to send me free games? Like, yes, please. And so I had so many publishers reaching out to me to send me free games. And that just kind of, it just was something that I just continued to do even after lockdown because I really enjoyed it. Like I really enjoyed talking about board games, and I started a YouTube channel, and then I started a longer series where I talk about all the games I have played in the last week. And I was already kind of involved in the board game community before then. I was very active in a lot of different Facebook groups in the board gaming world, so this just, kind of just went with that. And I've loved it. It's just been really, really great. And I love the opportunity to, be able to talk to designers since I now have those connections. I love, playing games that no one else has gotten a chance to play yet. It just kind of makes me feel special. So, yeah, but it's a lot of fun. I mean, board games, I just love them so much. And yeah, it's been amazing.
no, that's awesome. So yeah, and to some degree, I feel like also we've heard this on the show before, talking with people about various things, but being early, doing it consistently, being on TikTok, and clearly providing some value. I mean, I think as a viewer, I've watched a few of your videos, but I mean, they're very good, and they give you a real sense of the games. So I think probably one of the major things, in addition to just doing it a lot, is consistently providing value. So casual players, people considering spending $50 to $80 more on a game, get a sense of, if it's going to be for them.
Yeah.
So I think that is cool. And clearly there's an art to it, and you must've had some intuition about it, but I imagine you've gotten better over time. Or the things you've changed as a reviewer, your lens on things over the
I'm
years?
surprised that I still get asked this one question since I've been creating content now for like over 4 years. But basically, for people who aren't familiar with my content, I do like 1 to now 3 minute overviews of board games where I talk about the gist of a game and sometimes go into even more detail than just an overview. And people are always like, do you have a script? Like, do you have a teleprompter? Like, how do you just do all of that in 1 to 3 minutes? And I don't have a script and I don't have a teleprompter. I think the reason or the way I'm able to condense a board game into a few minutes is, first of all, I play it, but I think also my career has helped me to bring out the main points of a board game. So being an attorney and needing to know what the main points are of a document, I think has really helped me to, really bring out the main points of a board game. So yeah, just recently, because I had 2 videos that for games that launched just today. So both Luthier, The Art of the Instrument, and Yonder were 2 games that launched on Kickstarter today. And the designer of one of them asked me if I used a teleprompter. And I was like, I can't believe people are still asking me this 4 years later. Like, no, I don't use a teleprompter. But I feel like I've definitely gotten better at it. So it does take me, like back when I first started creating content, it could take me up to 100 takes to get a video right, where I felt like it was good enough for me to put out on the internet. Now it does not take me 100 takes, and thank God, because that would be a lot of time.
It's a lot of takes.
89 takes. That's it.
Yeah, it's a lot of takes. So no, I've gotten much better at it. It does not take me nearly as long as it used to in order to, speak about a board game in a couple of minutes and bring out the good points of it.
Yeah. I mean, it would make sense that as an attorney, you get practice in clearly enunciating to an audience something relatively complex in a compact, time frame.
Yeah.
And I imagine also practice makes perfect, right? So now that you've reviewed so many games, as you say, you're reducing the amount of time you have to spend to communicate the same value or even greater value, because you now have a bigger corpus of kind of data in your head, in terms of, as a reviewer. It is fun. It also just makes me think, and it may be apocryphal, I'd have to Google it. It's been a long time since, art school, but that David Fincher filming Fight Club had like Brad Pitt fall down the stairs like 12 times in a row, and like he got really hurt, and then at the end was the first one was good. Like definitely the first one, and everyone on set was like, "Why'd you do that like 12 times?" And he was like, "I don't know, like maybe it was going to be different." Like, it's the first one.
Gosh.
But I always remember, and again, maybe that's apocryphal. You swap the names out for whomever, but it stuck in my head as like that's part of the experience of artists. Sometimes you'll do it like 30 times, whatever it is, rewrite the same passage. You're like, no, I nailed it the first time. It's
Okay, Stanley Kubrick.
yeah. But so that's great. So it's also great to hear that you like reviewing. I do think criticism is it used to be more respected as an art in general, and then now that everyone's kind of a critic and so many people have sort of a social media presence where they're giving their opinion about some aspect of culture, especially in nerd culture, right? That it can seem to have lost its kind of edge
there's a lot of controversy in the board game community about paid reviews or paid previews. So I say that my content, I do paid previews, not paid reviews, because you should not be paid for your opinion on a game. However, if I'm being paid, so my overview videos are sponsored, so in those, I'm not like giving my opinion of the game. I'm just basically giving a gist of how it plays. But there are, the lines have gotten very blurred, and it's a controversial topic in the board game industry when it comes to content creators who do really charge a lot of money. Like my videos are not as polished as a lot of people who try to do this more professionally and try to maybe do it as their livelihood. For me, it's still something that I do for fun. So but lines have gotten blurred, and it's a topic of discussion, a hot topic of discussion always, whether someone was paid to put out a good opinion or not on a game.
And I think that's so, but I mean that's very live discussion with TTRPGs as well. I mean, people get paid, pay for reviews to try to break through the sort of morass of just voices on X and Instagram and TikTok and wherever. And how do you get anyone's attention? And they're, paid marketing is real, but I think often what works the best is that authenticity of getting people, whether it's a mass of unknowns or whether, you get essentially influencer marketing. You get a couple people who are able to engage with the game authentically and say, yeah, it's really good. But it's hard. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to people who are looking to pay for reviews because, how else can you get started? You have to start somewhere. How do you get any kind of audience if you don't have cultural capital coming in? So it sucks. I mean, it's kind of a rock and a hard place. But I do really think, I was just going to say, I think it's commendable to take it seriously and do good reviews and do it consistently and have a voice that's trusted, because then you can play some of that arbitering role that reviewers traditionally played in the arts before the internet of, you have to kind of trust somebody to know which movie to spend, I don't know, $1985 on, right? Are you going to go see E.T.? Are you going to go see, I don't know, Steel Magnolias, whatever it is, right? And I think, you had to sort of have someone doing some of the sifting work, the sorting work, because you have a day job, you have other responsibilities. I don't think it's that different with board games or RPGs. It's just now everyone is a critic, and it's maybe even harder and harder to kind of create trust. So I think one of those marks of trust is just being early and being consistent and doing it for a long time. So, good. That's awesome. Maybe one day you will play one of our games that we'll actually publish and give us your honest opinion, and we'll have a very weird conversation. It's totally crap. It's got all these weird story elements.
I would love to play your guys' board game. I really look forward to it. That's awesome.
Well, hopefully this fall we can all get together. If not at Flag, somewhere.
FlagCon or PAX Unplugged. I mean, time goes by very quickly.
We'll be at both.
We'll be at both. All right. Well, we're over time, I think. So thank you guys for such a great and in-depth discussion. I want to give you all the last word. As usual, this is Why We Roll. Chris couldn't make it, but thanks to everyone who's listening. And you cannot buy board games by us, although very soon you will be able to buy Robot Hospital, the card game that Aaron made. Not like tomorrow, because it has to get printed in China, and then it gets shipped into Tennessee, and then by the fall,
a rowboat, right?
Buy it. Yeah, it's on a rowboat. I hope nothing happens from Ningbo to Port of LA to Tennessee. So in the meantime, Aaron, we'll give Sarah the last word. Aaron, do you want to have any final thoughts, anything you want to reflect on? And also, what do you want people to do other than obviously check out Robot Hospital? It will be very inexpensive and super fun when it finally arrives.
I think my only final thought is I really like what Sarah was saying about how her experience as an attorney has helped her interface with the board gaming world better or in a unique way. I'm a developer as my day job, and the abstraction and testing that I do definitely plays out in my board game design process. So I would say that anybody who's interested in designing games should look to what skills they have in other arenas and see the ways that they can manifest those into their design process. It's sort of like your own personal perk that you have as a character that lets you do one thing just a little bit better. What is your perk? Find that perk and then use it to make your games more unique or personal. My social presence, I don't use a lot of them anymore, but Armahillo in most places, and I have various blogs and things, but you should just look at Stillfleet stuff. That's where all my new content has been going there.
That's such a great idea. That what is your perk that you built your character with when you spec'd into that in high school and college or whatever.
Yeah.
I just want to correct myself before we give Sarah the last word. It was not Brad Pitt. It was the stuntman who had to fall down the stairs.
Oh, I was going to say
12 times.
Kudos to Brad Pitt for doing his own stunts, like falling downstairs.
No, not a rich
He's
famous
not Tom
guy.
Cruise, right? Tom Cruise does his own stunts. So.
Oh my God. Sarah, where can people find you? What do you want people to do? I assume you want them to go check out your reviews, but
sure. No, I would love them to go check out my reviews. So if they're interested, they can find my channel on YouTube. It's Board Games in a Minute. And I'm also on Instagram under Board Games in a Minute. But what I would really like people to do is, just be kind to animals. And if you ever see an animal in need, just, do something. I know this has nothing to do with TTRPGs or board gaming, but I think a lot of people, if they see an animal in need, they'll think that, oh, someone else will take care of it. Well, you are someone and you can do something. And if everyone has the mindset that someone else will do it, then no one's going to help that animal that needs help right then and there. So if you are in a position to help an animal, please do. That is my last thought.
Yeah, we back that 100%. Thank you so much, not only for your thoughts on games, but also thinking about our non-human cohabitors on Earth. All right. Well, thanks a lot. This has been Why We Roll. We really appreciate having on Sarah Shah and Aaron H. And thanks to anyone who listens. And thanks to Vex, who says, give animals tiny hats, feed them snacks and water. Timeless advice. I'm going to click end stream.